Chapter 7. The Lion's Share. In Ernesto Sabato's 1950 novel, The Outsider, the protagonist says, "I must now confess that I do not like blind people at all, and that in their presence I feel something of the same sensation that cold, damp, and silent animals, such as snakes, give me." Unfortunately, those same sentiments still too often underlie the attitude with which sighted people regard the blind. The blind are too different. They act peculiar. They only like to be around other blind people. They are somehow inferior. Over the years, numerous trainees at our center have told me essentially the same story. When I go shopping with a sighted person, they say, sometimes the clerk gives my change to the person with me as if I don't exist. As a matter of common sense, blind people are not that different from their sighted counterparts. People who lose their sight do not forfeit their intelligence, or their imagination, or their reasoning power, or their sense of humor. They do not cease to be loving, friendly, or courageous human beings. Most importantly, blind people are individuals. They have individual dreams, needs, and potentials. One of our main goals at the AEB has been to restore a sense of dignity and self-worth to people blinded as adults. Because so much effort is expended on the reclamation of a single person, the value of the individual is a theme that dominates virtually everything we do at the center. My most cherished hope is that more and more of the sighted community will judge blind people as individual human beings and not as a group totally separated from the mainstream of American life. I think this dream might come true if more people knew personally some of the trainees who have gone through our program at the AEB. For the most part, they are wonderful people. Oftentimes, their stories are studies in hope and courage. A few even reach heroic proportions in the quiet dignity with which they have restructured the course of their lives. When most of our trainees first arrive at the center, they are in a stage similar to a butterfly waiting for a chance to emerge from its cocoon, and we provide what we hope will be, in the words of songwriter Paul Simon, a bridge over troubled water to enable them to resume responsible and productive places in their respective communities. One of the first and most outstanding individuals to cross that bridge was a young man from Nashville, Arkansas, named A.B. Bunk Goodrum. My long association with Bunk began in the mid-1950s with a phone call from a member of the Nashville Lions Club. My Lion friend told me about a recent graduate of their local high school who had gone to Houston, Texas to work, but had returned home totally blind. The Lion had no idea what had caused the young man to lose his sight. He told me that although Bunk Goodrum had been an excellent student and member of the high school football team before he went to Texas, he had now become a recluse in his family home in Nashville. I referred the matter to the Vocational Rehabilitation Office, and they sent a counselor to talk to Bunk and his family. The counselor reported that Bunk refused to see him and closed the file with a note that the person was not interested in rehabilitation. On a hunch, I telephoned my contact in Nashville and asked him if he thought Bunk's parents might be able to influence him to at least visit our facility in Little Rock. He informed me that Bunk's mother and father were separated, and the mother had to work to put an older son through Henderson State College in Arkadelphia. I told the Lion that I understood Bunk's experience. He felt embarrassed and ashamed, and I knew a personal visit from me would not change his feelings. So I encouraged my friend to try to convince Bunk's mother to bring her son to Little Rock. A few weeks later, the young man and his mother arrived at the center. At the time, Bunk suffered from an intense state of depression, responding to polite inquiries with monosyllabic grunts. I escorted the two of them on a tour of our facility, explaining the nature of the program and introducing them to our staff and trainees. Mrs. Goodrum soon became convinced Bunk needed the services we provided, and that same afternoon she completed the necessary paperwork for his admission to the center. Over the next 6 weeks, Bunk's personality changed completely. He learned that he could be independent again, could participate in social activities, and date young ladies. He discovered he did not have to live the remainder of his life as a hermit, locked away in his mother's house in Nashville. In that brief period of time, his natural outgoing personality reemerged, and he became one of our most popular trainees. He also shed his suspicions of those who wanted to help him. One afternoon, when he and I were strolling around the grounds, Bunk stopped and said, "Mr. Kumpe, you know, I just couldn't believe it when I first came over here and I heard those people talking and laughing. I thought it was all a setup you'd planned just to impress me." On another occasion, I stopped by Bunk's room to discuss his future. All of our tests indicated he had the capabilities of doing college work, but I suspected he might not be interested in returning to school. I asked him frankly why he hadn't attended college after he finished high school. "I wanted to," he said, "but I knew I couldn't because my older brother already attended Henderson, and I knew my mother couldn't afford to send both of us. That's why I went off on that construction job in Texas." He proceeded to tell me about waking up one morning in Houston and discovering he had lost his sight. I questioned him further and discovered he had suffered from detached retinas, a malady that often affects its victims with sudden and irreparable blindness. Encouraged by his rapid progress at the center, I urged Bunk to consider going to college. I explained that the vocational rehabilitation laws entitled him to have all the cost of his books and tuition paid by the government. I also counseled him to attend Henderson because his brother could help him if the need arose. Before he left for school, Bunk completed a Dale Carnegie course, which increased his self-confidence, and I had great hopes he would do well at Henderson. Bunk's success in college exceeded my every expectation. His classmates elected him president of the freshman class, and later president of the sophomore and junior classes, and vice president of the student body. Excelling in the classroom and in extracurricular activities, he graduated with a degree in education. Before Bunk finished his degree, the instructors at Henderson tried to convince him to do his practice teaching at the School for the Blind. The rehabilitation counselor and I traveled to Arkadelphia to attempt to dissuade them. I knew he could do the job in public school, and I wanted to shatter the myth that a blind person could only teach blind children. During the course of that meeting at the college, the young man who placed the practice teachers in various school districts became rather vexed at the whole situation, and finally said, "What will the school people think about us here at Henderson if we send them a blind person?" Prejudice takes many forms, and Bunk and I met this remark with a long and icy silence. Immediately upon returning home, I contacted some friends of mine at Little Rock Central High School, one of the nation's most outstanding secondary schools, and asked them if they would consider allowing Bunk to do his practice teaching there. They agreed, and Bunk Goodrum became the first blind person to complete his practice teaching in a public school in Arkansas. He taught history and kept his lecture and lesson notes in Braille. Excelling in the classroom, he became one of the most popular teachers on the campus that term. After his graduation from Henderson, Bunk won a scholarship for a professional training course at the Industrial Home for the Blind in Brooklyn, New York. I was so proud of this young man. Only a few years earlier, he had been afraid to even leave his own house, and now he could travel alone to New York for a 20-week training course. After Bunk completed his program in Brooklyn, I offered him a job at the center. Because of his record and his personality, he unquestionably could have worked in the public schools, but I also knew he would be a tremendous inspiration to our new trainees. He accepted my offer and joined our staff as a Braille instructor. Gradually, he became involved in our public relations efforts, speaking to Lions clubs and other groups throughout the state. After a few years, he took a leave of absence and earned his master's degree in guidance and counseling from the University of Arkansas. Frankly, I harbored great expectations that someday Bunk would become the executive director of the Rehabilitation Center in Little Rock. However, his talents and ambitions led him in a different direction. He became a rehabilitation counselor in Houston, Texas, where, after receiving a promotion to area supervisor, he eventually became the director of rehabilitation at the Lighthouse of Houston, Texas. When Bunk married one of our cited home economics teachers, he asked me to serve as his best man at the wedding, and I gladly accepted the honor. Bunk Goodrum is an outstanding individual who symbolizes what blind people can accomplish when they decide to pursue their own dreams and abandon a reclusive life of self-pity. Our goal at the Rehabilitation Center has always been to provide people like Bunk with the necessary tools to achieve those goals, to provide a bridge over troubled water. While blindness is unquestionably a severe handicap, the loss of sight does not necessarily destroy an individual's talent. I cannot think of a better example of a blind person who developed a natural talent and used it to its fullest potential than a young lady from New Orleans named Candy Rydell. Candy came to the AEB Center for our college preparatory course in the summer of 1968. We had started this program 7 years earlier under a research and demonstration grant from the federal government. The course served blind high school graduates who had an outstanding scholastic background. During a special 9-week summer course, the college prep students received the same instruction our regular trainees, plus additional academic work and discussions dealing with various problems they might encounter as college students. How to locate readers, how to get books transcribed, the importance of extracurricular activities, how to take effective class notes. As part of the program, we also had our students audit a regular college course at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, which is located 2 blocks from the AEB campus. Candy Rydell entered our college prep program with excellent credentials. After attending the Louisiana School for the Blind for a few years, she transferred to a girls' Catholic school where she maintained an outstanding academic record. She had a fine mind and enrolled at Loyola University in New Orleans the fall after completing her training at the center. The following spring, Candy wrote me asking if she could return to Little Rock in the summer and work at the center as a volunteer. I accepted her generous offer, and that summer Candy provided a fine addition to our staff. A music major at Loyola, she worked in our recreation program, playing the piano and leading group singing sessions. When she returned the next summer, we supplied her room and meals while she continued to expand the musical side of our recreational activities. In July, the Governor's Committee for Employment of the Handicapped met in Hot Springs, and the program chairman asked me if we had any talented young people at the center. I took Candy to the meeting where she played the piano and sang for the group. I knew after that that Candy Rydell had a promising future in the field of music. Suggesting she alter her course of studies slightly and major in music therapy, I hoped that Candy might someday return to our center and develop a complete program of musical recreation. When she discussed the changes with her guidance counselor at Loyola, however, he discouraged her because the internships for music therapy majors usually took place in mental hospitals, and he felt that would be a dangerous situation for a blind person. Although I thought his attitude reflected a lack of understanding of both blindness and mental illness, he managed to convince Candy to continue her major in musical education. Following her graduation, she worked at the center for a few years, but I suspected in a matter of time her ability would lead her in a different direction. One day, a talent agent heard her sing at a wedding and offered her an audition at a nightclub in the French Quarter in New Orleans. Candy turned down the position because she considered it inappropriate for her, but a few months later she received another job offer as a piano bar entertainer at Dan's International Lounge in Fat City, a section of New Orleans where neighborhood people go to avoid the tourists. Candy accepted the spot at Dan's and has worked there for over 5 years, attracting a loyal local following. I've visited New Orleans several times since Candy left Little Rock, and on each trip I have stopped by Dan's to hear her perform. She adds new songs, and her show changes and improves each time I hear her. One thing that does not change is the quiet pride I feel whenever I hear Candy's voice, the voice of a young blind person developing her talent to its utmost capability. One afternoon in the early 1950s, I received a call from the director of the Services for the Blind in Oklahoma City. He informed me that he had a young man there who had recently been blinded in a gunshot accident. Through an unusual set of family circumstances, the young man was about to be released from the hospital, but had no place to go. Since we had bed space available at the center, I agreed to take him as a trainee, although this was the first case we had ever accepted directly from a hospital. Jerry Dunlap had only been blind for 3 weeks when he came to the center in Little Rock. I vividly remember the Saturday afternoon he arrived because we were having a dance for the trainees that evening. I debated with myself whether to take Jerry to the dance since he had just joined us, but finally decided that the dance could teach him an immediate and valuable lesson, that blind people could still have fun. Although Jerry did not participate in the festivities much that night, several of our younger trainees, like Bunk Goodrum, stopped by and welcomed him to the center, and the positive feelings from that first experience provided a solid foundation for Jerry's adjustment training. Our new trainees had usually been blind for 3 or 4 years, and had learned from their families how a blind person should act. In Jerry's case, he had not been blind long enough to develop any bad habits, and consequently adapted quickly to mobility training and the other facets of our program. Jerry became friends with Lyle Toome, our blind psychologist, and Lyle later told me that when Jerry first came to the center, he had not had time to recover from the shock of his blindness and fully realize what had happened to him. Having completed high school, Jerry had planned to attend college and study forestry at the time of his accident. We encouraged him to pursue his goal of returning to school, although we also helped him investigate some alternative avenues of study. Following a 4-month training period at the center, Jerry returned to his native state and entered the University of Oklahoma at Norman. Toward the end of his freshman year, he wrote a note informing me he had decided to become a counselor like Lyle Toome and asking if he could spend the summer at the center to help our new trainees in exchange for his room and board. I thought the arrangement would be mutually beneficial, and Jerry returned to the center that summer. After finishing his bachelor's degree in psychology at the University of Oklahoma and marrying the young co-ed who served as his reader, Jerry attended Texas Tech in Lubbock, where he received his master's in psychology and counseling. Returning to Oklahoma, he started his career as a counselor in the state's rehabilitation program before becoming a supervisor, and finally program administrator of visual services. While Jerry's vocational success certainly pleased me a great deal, I also applauded his active involvement in our professional organizations. He helped organize the first chapter of the American Association of Workers for the Blind in Oklahoma and served as the group's first president. In 1979, after a term on the national board of the AAWB, Jerry Dunlap became the national president of the association, the same position I had held almost 30 years earlier. As president of the AAWB, Jerry acted as a delegate to the World Council for the Welfare of the Blind, which met in Antwerp, Belgium in 1979. I represented the International Services for the Blind at that same meeting, and when I heard Jerry present a fine scholarly paper at the convention, I realized that he had become one of the new young leaders in the international movement to aid the blind. During the time Jerry received his adjustment training at the center in Little Rock, he and Bunk Goodrum became close friends, and I sometimes saw that relationship as a friendly sibling rivalry. Both of these men have done extremely well in their chosen careers, and I regard each of them as an example of what I had originally hoped the Rehabilitation Center would be able to accomplish. As I listened to the applause for Jerry Dunlap's paper in Antwerp, I couldn't help but think about some of the blind people I encountered earlier in my career. Those unfortunate individuals who spent most of their lives in the back bedroom or rocked their lives away in the useless idleness on the front porch of a generous relative. The success of men like Bunk Goodrum and Jerry Dunlap helped demonstrate that blindness could be overcome, and as Helen Keller once said, the blind could enjoy life's sweet accomplishments. When we first opened the Rehabilitation Center in 1947, I never dreamed that someday we would be serving clients on an international basis. But after more than 30 years of operation, we have trained hundreds of blind individuals from all over the world. One of the most interesting of these international trainees was a young lady from Antwerp, Belgium, named Sylvia Roos. I first heard about Sylvia when I received a call from a friend of her family, a man who operated an import-export business in New York City. He told me that when Sylvia was in her mid-20s, she had been blinded in an automobile accident while vacationing in Italy. The family had searched worldwide for a rehabilitation program until the American Foundation for the Blind referred them to Little Rock. At first, the family's inclination had been to keep Sylvia at home, where servants could wait on her. But she had inherited a part interest in the family printing and stationery business and wanted to learn to be independent enough to work in the office. When she first arrived in New York, several acquaintances urged her to go to the Carroll Rehabilitation Center in Boston because of its location on the East Coast. Some of these people even told her she probably would not be able to understand the kind of English spoken in Arkansas. The idea that Arkansas could have a quality program on a level with those in New York or Boston or Philadelphia has always been a difficult concept for our Eastern friends to accept. After a thorough investigation, Sylvia decided to stick to her original decision and participate in our course in Little Rock. She spent about 6 months with us, where she concentrated on typing and switchboard training, along with other basic skills like mobility and personal management. I visited with her several times and discovered that her father had been a charter member of the First Lions Club in Belgium. I found it ironic that years later his daughter would benefit from a facility sponsored by Lions clubs. After completing her training, Sylvia returned to Belgium, where, over her mother's protests, she rented her own apartment, did her own housekeeping, and worked every day in the family business. A few years later, she came back to Little Rock for a refresher course in mobility and Braille. During that period, she revealed to me that since her brothers were doing an excellent job of managing the family business, she had decided to stay in the United States. A few months after our conversation, she married one of our mobility instructors, set up housekeeping in an apartment in Little Rock, and enrolled in classes at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, ready to pursue a totally new life. One of the most courageous trainees that ever participated in our program at the center was Ann Johnson. During Ann's freshman year in medical school at the University of South Carolina, she lost her sight from diabetic retinopathy. She had been a child diabetic and had always held a single purpose in her life: to study medicine and engage in research for the treatment of diabetes. But the disease robbed her of her sight before she could achieve that goal. Like most victims of diabetic retinopathy, Anne went blind suddenly and found herself in a wake of emotional trauma and depression. After several months, a rehabilitation counselor in South Carolina referred her to our Center for Adjustment and Pre-Vocational Training. She wanted to enter our new program to prepare to become a taxpayer service representative. Her father worked for the Internal Revenue Service and knew about our success in teaching blind people to act as liaisons between the IRS and the public. For Ann's part, the reorganization of her life's goals, from medicine to a career in the Internal Revenue Service, posed serious problems. From her first day at the center, however, Ann Johnson demonstrated a rare combination of courage and determination. She went through all the steps of psychological, social, and vocational adjustment. She learned mobility, new communication skills, and daily living techniques, and after only 4 months passed the difficult evaluation test for the IRS program. While undergoing her adjustment training, Anne also became an active member of the community. She sang in the choir of a nearby Baptist church, joined several local organizations, and interacted with sighted people on a regular basis. Anne's TSR class in Little Rock included a nice young man from Boston, and about a year after she left to become a service representative in her home state of South Carolina, I received a wedding announcement. Since they had met while participating in our program, Anne and her husband returned to Arkansas for their honeymoon. A few months later, they moved to Boston, where she resumed her work for the IRS while her husband pursued a career in the state attorney general's office. Sometime later, I received a letter from Anne telling me about her recent promotion to training supervisor. In that capacity, she instructed sighted people in the intricacies of the laws and codes that govern our system of taxation. Through her own resolution and enterprise, with a little guidance from the center, Ann Johnson reorganized her life and demonstrated that blind people are perfectly capable of being productive citizens. Our theme at the AEB has always been to help blind adults find a new life. Billy Elder's experience with our program illustrates what can be accomplished when a blind person resolves to achieve that goal. When Mrs. Elder first arrived at the center in 1964, her life had reached a low point. A middle-aged wife and mother, she had gradually lost her sight from a disease called retinitis pigmentosa. In the immediate aftermath of her blindness, her Methodist minister husband became ill and had to be hospitalized in their hometown in Tennessee for an extended period of time. Mrs. Elder's indomitable spirit carried her through our adjustment program. Because she had been a teacher before the onset of blindness, at the conclusion of her training, I asked her to remain at the center as a Braille instructor. In that capacity, she was not only an excellent teacher, but also served as an inspiration to our new trainees. After a while, she became interested in our overall program and took a leave of absence to study for her master's degree in rehabilitation teaching at Western Michigan University. When she returned to Little Rock, I named her the supervisor of educational services at the AEB. As her interest in the cause of the blind grew, Mrs. Elder became active in the American Association of Workers for the Blind, and in 1975 she was elected vice president of the American Council of the Blind. One of Billy Elder's favorite sayings is that when life caves in, you are either buried or planted. Through her own inner strength, Mrs. Elder took charge of her own survival, and with the help of our staff and the Tennessee Rehabilitation Services, carved a new life for herself, a life filled with new experiences and opportunities for growth, a chance to be planted rather than buried. Sometimes a new life can simply be the independence to return to the activities and routines of an old life. I recall a series of conversations on the porch at the center with a trainee named Betty Miller that illustrated to me that a new life does not always have to be new. The mother of 3 children from suburban Tulsa, Oklahoma, Betty had suffered from night blindness for several years, but dismissed her condition as a common problem for adults. Then, on Christmas Day, 1966, her visual problem became acute. Looking at the twinkling lights on the family Christmas tree, she realized all the colors had blurred together. Covering her right eye, she discovered that out of her left eye she could see only an image about the size of a dinner plate. Her sight continued to deteriorate, and after years of frustrating visits to various doctors, an eye specialist in Massachusetts finally correctly diagnosed her problem. Betty had retinitis pigmentosa, a hereditary disease which causes a gradual degeneration of the retina. The disease left Betty without any sight in her left eye and with minimal light perception in her right eye. Initially, Betty tried to continue her regular activities, such as a weekly trip to a crosstown shopping mall and volunteer work at her local church. But following a series of embarrassing incidents, the outings ceased after about a year. Once she got into a police car, mistaking the vehicle for a taxi cab, and on another occasion, while trying to walk to church, she took a wrong turn and became lost in a neighbor's backyard. That was when I began sitting in the house, she told me later. I was too frightened to go out. I became depressed and anxious and wondered what the future held for me and if it was all worth it. Working through counselors at the Oklahoma Division of Visual Services, Betty and her husband Dave, a public relations executive, arranged for her to enter the AEB Center in Little Rock. A couple of days after she arrived, we had our first chat on the sunny solar porch on the center's multi-purpose building. "You can go from doctor to doctor and chase butterflies and rainbows," she said then, "but there is a time when you finally have to sit down and face it. I knew I would either have to come here or stay home and become a vegetable." After a short time, Betty became one of our most enthusiastic trainees. "The 2 weeks I've been here have given me more confidence than I had in my entire life," she told me at a second meeting. "I feel that if I want to go to the snack bar and get a cup of coffee, I can do it, even if I can't see the way." She went through our basic program with the goal of returning to Tulsa and resuming her duties as a wife and mother. 6 months later, she did just that. I spoke with her briefly the morning she left for home, and her changed outlook on her condition made me realize that being able to return to her former existence constituted a new life for Betty Miller. "I don't want to be treated like a cripple and babied and hovered over," she said. "I'll ask for help when I need it. Otherwise, I'll do things on my own. I'm not going to sit in the house alone ever again." The two most unusual trainees that ever participated in our program were a Korean War veteran and a stout lady from the hill country. I first heard about the former soldier through a frantic phone call from the state director of rehabilitation in Texas. He said that he had a young man named Archie McKnight who had not only been blinded in the war, but had received enough other injuries to qualify for 100% disability. As a result, he received a fairly large check from the government every month. Unfortunately, McKnight squandered his money on alcohol and women, and the Veterans Administration had given up on him as a hopeless case. The rehabilitation director thought participation in a program like ours might restore a young veteran's confidence and stability, and asked if I would be willing to accept him. Since I wanted to cultivate a relationship with the Texas rehabilitation counselors, I reluctantly agreed. We always admitted new trainees on Monday in order to take advantage of a full staff. However, the counselor from Texas brought Archie to Little Rock on Saturday afternoon. When I arrived at the office on Monday morning, the young lady who had admitted Archie informed me he had brought a gun with him. He had checked the pistol with his other valuables at the desk, and when I asked him about the weapons, he said it was a souvenir of his experience in Korea. Even at the time, I thought the fact that he brought 2 boxes of cartridges for his souvenir a bit unusual. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Archie McKnight antagonized everyone at the center. Because of his war record, he had an insufferable sense of superiority to other blind people and openly treated our staff with contempt. He also developed a crush on one of our female clients who was dating another young male trainee. Archie and the girl's boyfriend exchanged harsh words on several occasions. One afternoon, in the midst of a staff meeting, one of our secretaries quietly slipped into the room and informed me Archie had appeared at the front desk, announced he wanted to leave, and requested his valuables. "You didn't give him the gun, did you?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Yes, sir, I did," the secretary said. "You told me to always give the trainees their things when they leave." I rushed to the outside door, where I found Archie wandering around the side of the building. "Where are you going, Archie?" I asked from the door. He didn't answer. One of the sighted instructors informed me the young veteran had the gun in his hand. Fearing Archie wanted to challenge the girl's boyfriend, I told a member of the staff to circle around the building and lock the doors from the inside to protect the trainees. By the time Archie reached the entrance to the room where the other trainees were enjoying a special program, the staff member had managed to lock the door. Archie stood outside, pounding on the door and shouting the name of his rival over and over in an ominous chant. After phoning the police, I moved into the courtyard to try and dissuade the veteran from his mission. Then the gun went off. I immediately pressed my back against the wall, fearing that Archie wanted to shoot me. After a few agonizing minutes that seemed like an eternity, 2 police cars whipped into the parking lot. I cautioned the officers that while Archie was blind, he was still an ex-soldier who knew how to use the gun. With admirable courage, 2 of the policemen finally convinced Archie to drop his weapon. When one of the officers grabbed him, however, Archie put up a terrible struggle that only ended when all 4 policemen dragged him to the patrol car. Later that day, I learned how close to tragedy we had come. A bullet from Archie's gun had passed through the door into the room where Sam Wilkes, one of our instructors, had been trying to herd the trainees out the back way. The bullet had ricocheted off the tile floor and hit the ceiling, knocking plaster over Sam's leg. I learned several important lessons from the incident, including never to accept a client without a full medical history. We also changed our policy to require a careful check for guns, knives, or other weapons whenever a trainee first arrived. Unfortunately, we could not help every blind person referred to the AEB. Archie's war experiences had left permanent emotional scars that we could never overcome. Consequently, our whole staff tried to put the incident behind us as quickly as possible and turn our attention to the many trainees we could assist. One of those trainees we felt we could help was a stout woman named Mary. After Mary had been at the center for a short time, she fell on the stairs and injured her leg. About a week later, Ms. Rena Metcalf, our supervisor, phoned me at 2 o'clock in the morning to report that Mary had terrible abdominal pains and had screamed and cried all night. I phoned a doctor who lived near the center and who had helped us during previous emergencies. He diagnosed Mary's ailment as an acute appendicitis and gave her something for the pain, planning to remove her to the hospital later that morning. At 7 a.m., Ms. Metcalf phoned me again to tell me Mary's roommate thought Mary had a baby in their room. I told Ms. Metcalf I would hold the phone while she investigated the matter. When she returned a few minutes later, she breathlessly informed me that, oh yes, Mary does have a baby in the room. You call the ambulance, I said, and I'll call the hospital. The rehabilitation people in Mary's home state, the doctor who administered an admission physical and the physician who treated her at 2 a.m., had all failed to diagnose Mary's pregnancy. After the doctor had left that morning, Mary had delivered the baby herself, walked across the hall, and wrapped the infant in some towels she found in a linen closet. Of course, we immediately sent both Mary and her baby to the hospital and phoned the child welfare department. Mary swore she did not know about her condition and had no idea who had fathered the child. Eventually, Mary consented to give the baby up for adoption. Her roommate later confided in me she thought the baby resulted from a single incident when a young man took advantage of Mary while she was intoxicated. I explained to Mary that we did not want to make any moral judgments in the matter and assured her we would welcome her back at the center. She returned home for almost a year and then resumed her training in Little Rock. After completing her program, she married and later gave birth to 4 more children. Through the years, we have trained over 5,000 blind adults at the AEB in Little Rock. Many of those trainees represented a story of personal courage and accomplishment. For example, Med Donaldson of Paragould, Arkansas, at the age of 84, became the oldest trainee we had ever served. Med's colorful career included service in the Spanish-American War, a tour as a trick rider with the Wild West show, 4 years as one of Arkansas's original game wardens, and several years as a state policeman. A fiercely independent man, Med came to us to learn to get around downtown Paragould by himself and learn enough Braille to read the titles on the talking books he received in the mail. Even at 84, Med Donaldson refused to allow blindness to prevent him from establishing a new life. Of course, we served thousands of other trainees whose stories were no less dramatic. Charles B. Edwards from Conway, Arkansas, who, following his training, returned to his chosen occupation as an insurance agent and received the company's nationwide Agent of the Year award. Reverend Richard Ludden, a Methodist minister from Indianapolis, who thought his ministering days had ended when he lost his sight, but instead became the chaplain of the AEB and for many years conducted an important ministry to the blind. Finally, a 36-year-old mother of 3 children from Houston once yielded to the pressures of a divorce and a career crisis by placing a loaded .38 caliber pistol to her temple and pulling the trigger. "After I shot myself," she told me later, "I never lost consciousness. It was like God and I were having a battle, and God said I would live." The gunshot left her blind in both eyes, and I have rarely encountered a more despondent individual. After months of training and therapy, however, the young woman gained a new and more positive outlook. She became a medical transcriptionist and began doing independent counseling with both blind and sighted individuals who, like herself, had temporarily lost their way. Her new life then became an important instrument in helping others find their own fresh start. Blind people are individuals. They have individual hopes and dreams and fears. Some cope with their blindness better than others, while some never even try to reestablish a normal existence. In over 30 years of working with the Rehabilitation Center, I have met all kinds of blind people. Some of them have been the most remarkable individuals I have ever encountered. People like Bunk Goodrum, Jerry Dunlap, Ann Johnson, and so many others have, with hard work and quiet dignity, molded a new life for themselves. I only wish the central character of Sabato's The Outsider could have met some of these remarkable people. There is a footnote that the young man named Archie McKnight, that was not his real name.